We're going to get started, and I'm really just going to introduce Joe and Robert, and they're going to introduce themselves. I'm going to be here in the front, monitoring chat on Zoom. The session is being recorded, and if you are interested in asking a question, you can. Joe and Robert will direct you on how best to do that. There are microphones out on either side in the kind of main hallway that goes from one side to the other. You might need to either get up or we might get someone to come and bring the microphone to you. There is someone who will bring the microphone to you. Getting that signal in the back. So without further ado, Joe and Robert can introduce themselves and we'll get started.
Hi, everybody. I'm Joe Ferre Galicia. I'm an accessibility team lead here with Research, Teaching, and Learning.
And I'm Robert Hold, the Senior Visual Designer at Digital Learning Services in the Research, Teaching, and Learning Department. We're thrilled you're here today. I see some familiar faces, so thanks for being here.
So this is a hybrid presentation, so welcome to those in person and on Zoom. And we're going to start with a poll. Let's see if I could get this to work. Come on. There we go. So we're using poll everywhere. There's a QR code, and in the chat, Isaac's going to put a link to this poll everywhere. And the question is based on the title of this presentation or the description. I'm assuming you read the description if you're here. What would you like clarified during today's workshop? So what would you like clarified? And what we're going to do is have you start with some of these important questions, and then we're going to loop back at the end and make sure that we've addressed the most voted up on. So we're using poll everywhere, and there's a vote up feature. And at the end, if or while you're putting in your response, or if you see someone else's response that that you're interested in, use that little thumbs up, and it's a check mark, and it'll tally your interest as an audience. So here's the poll everywhere. It's a really nice integration. It's a it's a Chrome plugin specifically for Google Slides. And then if you are having any problems with accessing the poll, Bianco, can you raise your hand? Bianco is here. He could help you log in, or you could use his device to get your answers documented. Okay, so let's review some of those responses. I really like those responses. Okay, so again, we're going to get back to those toward the end, but let me go to the next slide here. So in terms of that term resilient, so that was one of the questions. And to contextualize this presentation, it's important to define the term resilient as adaptable and flexible as it relates to content created by instructors and instructional designers for a wide range of students' needs and preferences. This includes students with various types of disabilities such as visual, motor, hearing, cognitive impairments. Resilient in this context means that media created in one form can easily be converted to another media type. So for example, if you're creating a PowerPoint, the content in that PowerPoint could be converted to a PDF file, a website file, an LMS image, more likely to a voiceover where you're having narration over the image or the PowerPoint slide. That's one of the most common media types in higher education right now that we've encountered. So yeah, we just want to make sure we clarify this term resilient. And here's an overview of today's presentation. So, oops. So we started with the introduction. And we don't have enough time to go over everything about resiliency and multimedia, but we do have this website. It's an accessibility basics Canvas course, and at UC Berkeley, we've branded Canvas as B courses. So we'll provide a link in the chat for that, and then we're going to show you 2 videos. One of them is specifically on multimedia best practices. The other one is on using the color contrast analyzer tool to analyze the contrast between foreground and background in your media content so that it is WCAG compliant. We're going to have a lot of polls where participants will be able to identify possible problems in some slide decks. And then we'll have results, discussion. We're going to return to that original poll to make sure we covered it. And then there'll be time for a Q&A. And then we're going to have a closing feedback poll as well. So this is the Accessibility Basics B Courses site. It was built with universal design for learning in mind. It has multiple means of representation for the content. And specifically, we're going to be covering the multimedia and the color aspects. And if you want to get to the website or the course site, there's a QR code. And then in chat, Isaac's going to put the link to the multimedia best practices, which he's got. All right, great. So this is the video that we're going to play, and I encourage you to take notes because, or not notes, but pay attention because we're going to do a little back and forth with some specific media PowerPoint slides that we're going to ask you to use poll everywhere to identify possible problems. But this video is really good at helping you identify, giving you the skills to identify those issues. So Ian, if you could go ahead and hit play. And we're going to need the sound on that.
Charts, graphs, and images are commonly included as content in a video production. It is important to follow accessibility best practices with your use of narration, fonts, contrast, and color. This is especially true for productions that use screen recording of a slideshow presentation with audio narration. This voiceover format is often used to capture classroom lectures using software such as PowerPoint, Keynote, and Google Slides. To reach students with visual disabilities, read aloud important content written in your slides and describe figures and visual aids. This allows the audio track, transcript, or caption to offer another way to distinguish visual elements. Use appropriate font sizes and font types. Use 20-point or larger font size for the slide titles. Use at least 18-point font size or larger for the slide content. Use sans serif fonts like Arial, Helvetica, or Verdana. Use mixed case, not all caps. Making content legible is essential for low vision and colorblind users. This is best achieved by providing sufficient color contrast between foreground and background. Guidelines state the visual presentation of text must have a contrast ratio of at least 4.5:1 for normal text and 3:1 for large and linked text. Large text is described as 18-point or 14-point bold or larger. There are many free color contrast analyzers available to gauge color contrast ratios. Color should not be used as the only way to convey meaning, prompt a response, or distinguish visual elements because it can make content inaccessible to blind and visually impaired learners. If color is used to convey meaning, instructors are encouraged to describe how color is used in their audio description of the presentation. Also, try to avoid using red and green to convey meaning or as the only way to differentiate content. Users who have color blindness benefit when information conveyed by color is available in other visual forms. Add labels or patterns to distinguish content in charts or graphs and include this information in a legend. Follow these best practices to make your course content more accessible.
Okay, so we're going to summarize those key points that you just watched in that multimedia best practices little video. And I want to share, in my role as senior designer, I create graphics and typography for online courses and presentations, and I utilize these key practices in my daily work. And the first one is, as it said in the video, use 20-point or larger font size for headlines and titles. And I usually use 35 to 50. I always want to be safe than sorry. And use at least 18-point size font or larger for the body text. And I usually use 20 points or larger. And you want to use sans serif fonts, Arial, Helvetica, and really avoid the temptation of using a flowy script or handwritten font. I see that a lot. I think people want it to feel more humanized, but just stick with sans serif fonts. Your content is enough. And also avoid hairline or thin fonts, whether they're serif or sans serif. You want to use at least a regular point or bold. Also use mixed case and not all caps. And I know some folks use all caps to emphasize content, but I would steer away from that and use like a heavier weight font. And I usually like to pick a font that has more than 3 weights. You can find a lot of fonts on Google Fonts that have like 10 weights, and then you can use like a ultra or a heavy. And I do think a small word could be all caps, such as on a chart or a map, but you really want to remember legibility and not use all caps in a sentence or a long headline. And then address the use of color as meaning. For example, if all the green text is relevant to teaching and all the orange text is relevant to staffing, you would want to have a clear key somewhere on your visual that clearly states that. And avoid red and green for meaningful color. These colors will appear similar to folks with some forms of color blindness, and we'll share what that looks like in a moment. And you want to describe meaningful content. You want the text, the image, and what you're verbalizing to be together in tandem. And this includes also labeling charts with an explanatory title and including a defined X and Y axis and a key, like I said, if needed. I learned this firsthand last year in a Zoom class, and my internet went out, and the instructor told everyone in the class, look at the slide and we're going to discuss it. And I didn't know what they were looking at because I had called in on Zoom. And so I learned firsthand, you really need to describe what you're showing to the viewer. And then also use sufficient color contrast. And we use the color contrast analyzer tool to do that. And right now, we'll go back, we'll share the link to the color contrast analyzer video we're going to watch. And I want to preface, don't worry about downloading this color contrast analyzer tool right now. We're just showing you so you have an understanding of this is what is used. I would recommend after the class, maybe take in an afternoon, download it and play with it. But this will kind of give an overview of color.
People with visual impairments may not be able to easily distinguish color differences in digital content with insufficient contrast. The free desktop application, Color Contrast Analyzer, measures color contrast ratios on digital content based on web content accessibility guidelines. Learning to use this important tool will help you create more legible digital content that can be accessed by people of various visual abilities. To begin, download and open the Color Contrast Analyzer app. Select the foreground eyedropper tool and hover over and select the foreground or text color. Next, select the background eyedropper tool and hover over and select the background color. The app provides results for the two colors selected in the contrast ratio field and indicates whether they're conformant for regular size text, which is between 12-point and 17-point for most font types, or large text, which is any text exceeding 18-point or 14-point bold. University of California policy requires campuses meet the WCAG 2.0 AA guidelines. AA level contrast ratios are 4.5 to 1 for regular text and 3 to 1 for large and linked text. Although it is not required to exceed AA guidelines, you might still want to consider something with higher than minimally conformant contrast ratios. This will make your content even more legible and account for contrast degradation that often takes place when exporting content to a video format. In this example, the color contrast ratio for large text is sufficient, but not for regular size text. To meet regular text color contrast ratio guidelines, choose a font text and background combination with a higher contrast ratio. In this case, changing the background color to a darker shade increases the contrast ratio to conformant levels. Another way to obtain sufficient contrast is to add an outline to the text type. In this case, a black outline works well. And remember, this helpful app can be used with many types of digital content, including web pages, PDFs, Word documents, as well as PowerPoint and Google Slide presentations. For more information on digital accessibility, email allyhelp@berkeley.edu.
Okay, so that was part of the Accessibility Basics course under color. And let me see, oops, here we go. Okay, so this is the summary of for that video. So accompany colored content with visual indicators, such as an asterisk with an explanation of how color is being used to convey meaning. Avoid using red and green as the only way to convey meaning. You could use red, you could use green, but it shouldn't be the only way to convey meaning. The contrast ratio should be 4.5 to 1 for regular text and 3 to 1 for regular and hyperlinked text. And account for color contrast degradation when converting to video format. A lot of people don't realize this, that if you're just barely meeting the guidelines in a slide deck and you know you're gonna make it a voiceover video, there is degradation in that exportation process. So increase those ratios. And then use digital tools to measure color contrast ratios. And in the color part of the course that we listed, there's multiple color contrast analyzer tools that you can use. Okay, so next we're gonna see how we could apply some of this content. So if you've already opened the poll everywhere, it's going to be the same link. So if it's open, it's going to change right now. Let me go ahead and move it over real quick. And then, okay, this is part of that, the plugin. It's really cool. So I just got to forward to the poll and then it'll activate it. So can I get a confirmation that the poll question changed in your ride? Wonderful. So this is Robert's point to show off some of his skills.
Well, so you all can, in the poll everywhere, identify any problems or issues you think this slide has. Or maybe it doesn't. You know, it could, like, in thinking back in the video you just watched, whether it was, you know, color, typography, case, is there charts?
And we're gonna do this for just like in a minute. So just really quickly try to identify some of the issues that this particular slide has, and then they'll get increasingly more complex. We have 3 examples. Okay, so let's go to activated. No, it doesn't.
You guys are great, you're catching all the issues. We'll go ahead and look at the slide now. Low color contrast, image doesn't convey context. Okay, we'll go to the next slide. Okay, so there's where we started. Now, next slide. So I'll just reiterate, and you guys caught, I would say, all of the problems. The first thing is the headline or title is all in caps. So that's a problem. And then the color contrast, the white headline on that orange, and it's hard to tell on these screens. It may look darker, but it doesn't pass the color contrast ratio, and nor do the bullet points or the listed text. And you don't want to forget the bullet points either. They need to pass the color contrast as far as that size, either large text or small text. And then the decoration, I see a lot of great presentations and they put decoration, they want it to feel human and whimsical. And, I'm a maximalist in my private life, but I really remove all decoration in presentations and academic content because you don't really need it. I think if it's relevant, include it. And if you include it, you also want to have a caption describing what it is. So if you really felt it was important to have the flower happy face, I would put a caption, flower happy face, and that would have to also be at least in 18-point type. But you guys did great identifying all those problems, and we'll go to the sample. We'll show, here's two boxes where we sampled it with the color contrast analyzer. So you can see that white text on the orange fails in all levels, from large text to small text. And then on the right, this box here, it fails, the listed text in that teal fails on white background. And I would say working with oranges and teals and blues, they're really problematic with the color ratio. And you usually want it to be darker than what you think it is. We'll go to the next slide. So what would I do? The first thing, you could make the headline and title case instead of all caps, and maybe I'll make it black. That would pass the color ratio. And then make the bulleted list all in a darker teal. That would pass. But then you think, well, that doesn't have the feeling or personality of my presentation. It looks kind of flat, so you kind of have to play around. So next slide. We'll go to the next slide. Okay, so what I would do, and you have to, the more you do it, you kind of have to play around. So if I still wanted to keep that white headline, I would darken the orange background box. And when you use that color contrast analyzer tool, you'll see there's a slider and you can push it till it hits the color that will pass. So that I would go that route. There's many different ways you can resolve these issues, but you really have to get in there and play with it. And then I would add, that darker orange for the bullet points, and those I know are 35 point or larger, and that would pass the color contrast for that. But again, you really want to go in there and practice with that color contrast analyzer tool. And once you start getting colors you like, keep a list of them, so you can still have the personality you want on the slides and the feeling. And then we'll here kind of summarize how we resolved that slide. First we changed the title to a title case, and we adjusted the colors for color contrast. We still wanted to keep it white headline, so we darkened the orange. And then we added the dark orange bullet points, and we made the list of text in a darker teal, and we removed the decoration here. Like I said, if you still want an image or something, try to have it relevant and include a caption. So there's the before and after, and the orange is darker, but I think you still keep the feeling and the tone of your original slide. And now we'll go to the second sample if you want to go back to the poll everywhere. Okay. So here's the slide number 2, and identify any issues you see here. And we'll give like about a minute. Okay, we'll show the results, and you can give a thumbs up if you see another one that you agree with. So let's see, script font with low contrast, color conveys meaning, color is used to convey meaning in the graph, serif font, you guys are on it, all great, spotting all the issues. So let's kind of summarize here. So we see the headline COVID inflation, it's in a decorative font that's difficult to read, and the color looks light there, it wouldn't pass the color contrast. So then the next thing I look at, okay, we have a chart. It has a headline and it has an X and Y axis, but is that enough? And then we see the key, there's a key, and it's all in caps and serif, so that's an issue. And then we see there's color issues, and there's meaningful data. US and Europe is in red and green. And so, next slide, we'll see how, let's tackle this slide, and we just summarized the problems, the fonts and the colors and the color of the meaningful data. So the first thing I would do, and like I said, there's multiple ways you can tackle these problems, and you kind of have to just start doing it and practicing, and you'll get your own solutions that work for your content. The first thing, change the headline to upper and lowercase in the sans serif and make it a darker green. And then we changed the colors of the 4 countries to accessible colors. And we left the average cost of a dozen eggs and all of that. But now let's take a look how this would look for someone that is colorblind. Oh, and also sometimes on keys or, explaining what they are, if it's really simple, I sometimes remove the key and move it to the data, but you don't want to do that if you have more than 3 categories. I just try to keep it really simple and clean. Okay, next slide. So here I went to a site called Venage, but there's many online where you can kind of simulate what it looks like for folks with issues. So on the right here, you can see it'll give you the regular vision. It'll give you color blindness to even how people would see your image with cataracts or low vision. So next slide. So there's how you can see our slide, how it would look with complete color blindness. And you see it all looks gray and black. You can't really differentiate that meaningful data. So how do you resolve that? Well, we recommend adding a pattern or a texture to the color. And that works if you don't have 12 categories. Here, this is a pretty simple chart. There's only 4 categories. So we added the dotted rule, and you might want to add a key to clarify that. But what do you do if this had 8 countries? Next slide. Well, here we can see how those patterns look in the colorblind test. And it will all go to gray and black, but it still looks different because of the patterns. So what I would do with this chart is you have to remember, what's the objective? Why are you showing this chart to the viewer? What do you want them to learn from this? And maybe I'm showing this chart because I wanted the student to learn the cost of eggs has doubled in price in Europe. So that becomes my next slide. So that would become my intentional content, and I want to write that down in a deck and really state that a dozen eggs have almost doubled in price in Europe since the beginning of COVID. And then I would also, if I didn't create this chart, if I pulled it offline and I just have a JPEG, I would highlight it in yellow and really pull out the information, the price. It went from $4.50 to $8.25 during COVID. So that all becomes the essential content. Next slide. And then you can see, just so it's clear, that's your objective of why you're showing this graphic. A dozen eggs have almost doubled in price in Europe since the beginning of COVID. Next slide. And then I highlighted that data in this chart. I still had the accessible colors, and you still want it to be the correct size if you can. And the next slide. And then everything else becomes incidental content. So this was just a very simple sample. You might have a really complicated infographic, but maybe it's a broad objective. You're just saying everything's gone up, and you see in a broad sweep, everything's gone up. So you really have to kind of consciously think, what are the objectives of why you're showing graphics and charts? And then let's summarize how we resolved this. And again, there could be many different ways, and it would depend on what the objective of this chart was for your viewer. But here we changed the font title to a sans serif, upper lowercase. We adjusted the colors for color contrast, and that was in the headline. We changed the colors of the countries and the meaningful data. We added patterns for color blindness because there was red and green that was meaningful content. And then we added a clarifying deck or subhead with the objective of the chart. And then we also highlighted the objective. And like I said, if I created this chart, maybe I remove USA, Canada, and Mexico and just show Europe. That's really what I want the viewer to learn. And then here's the before and after. So you see, you still have your chart and the data, but you've just kind of resolved it. And again, if you didn't create that chart, I would just type in your countries and remove that key. So now we'll go to the third sample. Again, log into the Poll Everywhere, and you should see this infographic chart. And kind of, again, you know the shtick, identify any problems or issues with this graphic. Okay. And we're going to move along quickly on this one. We'll go ahead and start looking at the results. So no slide title, small text, font is too small, color contrast, not 18-point size font. You guys are great, you're on it. For time's sake, we're gonna go ahead and move to the graphic so you can see this was I would call it an infographic. And a lot of times in your presentations or courses, it's something that was pulled off the internet. So I can't really edit it either. And it doesn't have a headline. You know, we'll go to the next slide and kind of summarize what the problems were, which you all identified. You know, there's no title or description. I don't know what I'm looking at. And I always go to the old-fashioned who, what, when, where, why, you know, when you're looking at your graphics. The text is difficult to read. There's color contrast issues with some of the text. And the measurements, we don't know what it represents. There's no key, we don't know what this is. You know, I don't know what I'm looking at. So the first thing, you'd want to add a title and a headline and a deck and clarify what those measurements mean. And this is really simple. I really think this probably would need a more in-depth subhead or deck to describe what we're looking at, you know, more than just grams of water per kilogram of air. And then let's show how we could resolve it, you know, because we saw those precipitation of land, water, that was difficult to read. And we heard in the video we watched, you could add a black outline around the white type to make it past the color contrast tool, but that's still difficult to read here because I would only do that with small words, you know, like 5 characters or less. So, because that still looks, it's illegible. So next slide. Then maybe I would go to just adding white boxes and then put the text, but you can see that really calls out the precipitation to land, the fresh water, and maybe that's not the objective of what this chart is that I want them to learn. So next slide. Next slide. So maybe it's the headline. I really want them to read the headline in that deck to really, that tells you what the objective is of this chart. Or maybe I want to add yellow, and maybe I do want to highlight those 3 categories and then put black text over it. Next slide. Or maybe you don't, you know, maybe you want it to really blend in, and this is another something that's kind of has a broad meaning, and the headline and deck could really explain what you want the viewer to get. So there I just matched the background color. So there, how we resolve this, again, you can see there's many different ways to tackle these accessibility issues. But here we added a title, you know, and again, think when, where, why, how. Fix the color contrast by adding boxes behind text and then retyping the text in that was difficult to read. And we'll go to the next slide. Oh yeah, so you can see the before and after, and now we'll go to the next slide. So now let's summarize. You know, we've gone over this a couple times, you know, creating resilient multimedia. And I would say, let me see, all of these are tenets of universal design, you know, and you might say, well, what is universal design? Well, universal design is the design of content or buildings or products or environments to make them accessible to people regardless of age, disability, or other factors. So it addresses common barriers to participation by creating things that can be used by the maximum number of people possible. And as Joe had said earlier, Being resilient means being adaptable and flexible. So I would recommend if you just start incorporating into your own daily work the font size. That is super simple. You know, keeping your headlines, titles in 20-point or larger, sans serif in 18 points for body text, and then using sans serif fonts, and avoid hairline or lightweight fonts. Be aware of color contrast. And again, please download that color contrast analyzer tool. And I will tell you, all apps can be a little quirky and weird, and that one is too. You know, sometimes if you click it, it doesn't work. Don't give up. Just keep at it and you'll kind of get the ins and outs of it. And then eventually you won't even need to use the tool because you can just look at it and you'll know. Avoid using all caps. If you want to highlight something, use a bolder text and use mixed case. Describe meaningful content. You know, you want your image, your words, and what you're saying to be in tandem together. And then address the use of color to convey meaning. So you saw that in different examples here, whether it was data lines in a chart or a key representing information. And then you saw why you should avoid red and green for meaningful content. And I still use red and green, and I still will use red and green in quotes in content that we produce, but I make it really dark rusty red, and then I use really dark olive green. So if the instructor's still saying the red rule or the red bar, it's in that same family. So you don't, but you need to get used to practicing and using these colors. But I definitely would, please, if you just want to start with something simple, start with the fonts and work your way up to using the color contrast tool. And I'll hand it over to Joe now.
Okay, so we're going to return to that first poll that we started with. And we got 10 upvotes for what considerations do I need to take when creating videos? So what Robert just summarized right now. It's not too overwhelming. Take it one step at a time. But it's like developing your muscles. You work out and you get used to it and it becomes a second nature.
Objective, really understand what your objective is for what graphics you have and why you're showing it.
And on that point, integrating audio description is really important for videos. So if there's meaningful content, have your subject matter experts describe that meaning, just like what Robert was doing earlier, because that gets on the audio transcript. It could be printed out, and it could be data mined too. You could download those transcripts and do some searching that way. What are the top 3 things that I could train faculty to do to have an impact on addressing accessibility? So I want to refer back to that accessibility basics course that I started with. There's more than 3 items on there. Pick any 3 on there and work on those. What is resilient multimedia? So we talked about that earlier, and taking into consideration those learners that have different types of impairments and different types of preferences. Incorporating that so that it goes from one media type to the other without much difficulty.
And I would say it's sort of like going to the gym. You're not going to go to the gym once and reach your results. You have to keep going and don't get frustrated. You just need to start, like I said, start with the font size and then use the color ratio tool.
Okay, we got 5 minutes. Just want to refer back to the B Courses site. So this is available to anyone outside of UC Berkeley. It's not password protected. And we're at the question and answer point. And Isaac, is there a burning question? Okay, if you're on Zoom and you have any burning questions, please put that in there. We're going to go to the audience. And Betsy has a mic, so if anyone has a question, raise your hand and she'll come right over. And this is a nice pregnant pause. Robert wants to.
I have a question, Joe. So what do you think is better as far as for accessibility? Is a dark mode? You know, I'm seeing a lot of folks using a black background. as opposed to a white background, text on a white background or using a black background, a dark mode.
Okay, so I'm actually a big fan of dark mode, and if you noticed on the poll everywhere, we did switch that theme. We enabled it. And one of the problems that I've come across on our edX platform is some instructors will be using different types of integration. Jupyter Notebook would be one. And the color contrast isn't very good on the stock themes, but it does have that ability to choose your themes, choose your fonts, your font sizes. And I do encourage that, to have more control. And if the goal is to convey meaning, then you want to reach the most diverse group as possible. And so taking into consideration students and learners with different types of learning needs and preferences. Any other questions so far here? And here we have a couple now. And Isaac, was there a question in the Zoom yet? Okay, great. That's how thorough we were.
Hi, I'm
Hi.
curious about document formats for syllabi, and if one is more accessible than another, like PDF versus Word or HTML. I am aware that some students with disabilities require printed things, and so downloadable things are sometimes preferred. So thoughts on that, and also I had another one if it gets back around.
Okay, great. Thank you for that question. So one of the first things that we did in my unit 9 years ago was we created accessible syllabi templates. So starting with a template that is styled, using headers, using self-describing links, making sure the color contrast, all of that, making sure that those templates are used by your different instructors, instructional designers, having those available in Word, starting with Word. Once you're in Word, you could easily convert those to HTML and include those in a LMS that way. But in the end, the student, if they're identified with a learning or with a letter of accommodation, your disability student program, that's disabled student program is what we use here at UC Berkeley for matriculated students. Whatever format is in that letter for that particular learner's preference will be generated by that entity. But it's usually Word. Word works well with AT. PDFs are really difficult, especially because there's a lot of tagging involved. If you start with an accessible Word file and you export it on a Windows machine to PDF, it's going to do pretty well. But there's still some tag trees that you got to work on, and a lot of people don't have the time to go into the tag tree. So my recommendation is, without that letter of accommodations, have a Word version available, but just keep it in the learning management system. That the LMS is one of the most accessible platforms that a student could engage in, especially if it's Canvas. I'm sorry, there's a follow-up part to this.
By keep it in the learning management system, do you mean keep the Word version in the learning management system?
Oh, yeah, so that's 2 points to that, yeah. So our DSP office they have a permission to go into our learning management system and look at the files in that. And if there's a Word file for that syllabi, they'll be able to find it and quickly get it to the student. But if you're just using, like in Canvas, there is the syllabus feature, and just keeping it in there, that's going to be the easiest, I believe. You could also convert the Word file to an HTML and create an LMS page for that content. Time's up. Thank you so much, everyone, for attending. Really appreciate it. Thanks to Isaac and all the staff, Betsy, Ian up in the control panel. Hope you have a really wonderful rest of this conference.
Thank you, everyone.